Okay, good day, everyone. My name is Jules Keith Lee, and I'm with the Center for Teaching and Learning. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this long-awaited special event. The Center for Teaching and Learning and the Active Learning Academy enthusiastically welcomes Dr. Laura Pipe's presentation, Coming in Hot, Active Learning, Online, and Equity. Today's session will be recorded and posted to the CTL's YouTube site, and Laura has prepared a Google folder full of resources, which will be shared with all who attend today. Thank you so much for doing that, Laura. So before we begin today's program, I want to share Laura's bio with you. Laura directs the Teaching Innovations Office, implementing pan-university faculty development initiatives at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, UNCG. Throughout her career, Laura has developed academically enriched programs that promote integrated learning, teaching innovations, and faculty collaboration. Her current work partners both a passion for integrated and applied learning with experiences in active pedagogies as UNCG embarks on a new vision of 21st century global and inclusive learning. Her expertise in inclusive teaching. Oh, I'm going to just pause for 1 second and make sure everybody's muted. Thank you. Her expertise is in inclusive teaching and integrated learning, and she serves on the editorial board for the Journal of Learning Communities Research and Practice and is a consulting editor for the journal College Teaching. Completing her undergraduate work at the Schiffer School of Journalism at Texas Christian University and her master's at the School of Education at Syracuse University, Laura has developed an expertise in applied, integrative, and active learning pedagogies, particularly in the area of learning communities and inclusive engagement. So please use the chat feature today for any questions you may have during Laura's presentation. Welcome, Laura. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. As Jules mentioned, this has been a long time coming. We've been working on having this for a couple of years. And actually going back through my notes to prepare for this, a lot has changed in the last couple of years. A lot has changed in the world that we live in, and a lot has changed in this work around equity as well. So I'm excited to be able to share with you some new things as well, some hot off the press type stuff. Let me see if I can, okay, perfect. So I want to start with a brief land acknowledgement. And I only chuckle a little because it's not going to be very brief, and I apologize in advance, but I think it's important. So I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that no matter where you are right now, whether you're on campus, whether you're at home, you're on stolen land. And that's not an ideology, it's a fact, right? We're all existing, as one of my native students likes to say, you're raising your family in someone else's living room. And so I want to invite each of you to kind of take a quick moment to visit the website that I have here at the bottom of the screen. It's native-land.ca. You can put in your hometown, your address, and see really whose land you're on. And this is probably by far the most robust database of historical Indigenous land data that's out there. And so I think it's important that we acknowledge whose land you're on, where you're at. And I have on the screen UNCC as well as UNCG's land acknowledgement. But I'm not coming to you from either campus. I'm coming from my home, and my home actually is located on the traditional lands of the Kiawe, Sara, and Catawba nations. And so land acknowledgements are important for a lot of reasons, but I think they're also very relevant for the conversation we want to have today around equity and around active learning. And so the equity portion is likely very obvious to everyone, right? If representation matters. By including a land acknowledgement in your syllabus or your email or in your courses, you're creating a space for Native and Indigenous students to really see themselves. You're also signaling an opening to be willing to have discussions around inclusion and to bring in stories and histories that are often absent from our classrooms, from the content, from the literature and the conversations that we have. So you're opening a door. And our Indigenous students at UNCG have shared that repeatedly, much like when faculty members put pronouns in their emails and on their syllabi, it signals a comfortable space where they're no longer invisible. But the active learning component of a land acknowledgement might not be as obvious. And so I kind of do want to share a little bit more about that. over the past 2 years in my own work, I've been really engaging in kind of a journey of reflection on my own place in indigeneity. My father's family is descended from the Tuscarora or the Haudenosaunee. And so in the past couple of years, I've really opened myself up to explore what that means for my teaching. And it means quite a bit. And so that led to a really great friendship and partnership with the Native students at UNCG, who also spent the last year engaging in what Indigenous pedagogy means for us here in the state of North Carolina, what it means for the Southeast woodland communities. And so that's where I really wanted to start, because active learning is central to these conversations in Indigenous learning. When I teach, I always talk to my students about the need for them to take a concept or knowledge and start to pull it apart and play with it in their hands, play with it and see where it lands, pull it inward, see where it settles for themselves, because that's where real learning begins. And I'm a kinesiologist by training. And so I teach a lot of sports sociology courses. And so it's not so far-fetched for me to ask students to play with information and them to kind of somewhat understand it. But that to me is an essential part of this. And so a land acknowledgement is really, for me, a signaling kind of the first steps of this work, right? That we're doing this work on the shoulders of giants who are still very present and very relevant in the spaces where we're teaching. And so that I really want to start us there. The second thing I really kind of want to start with is this image, because this is where the title came for this talk. When we planned it several years ago. And this image actually came from a time when UNCG had just started kind of embarking on using virtual reality in the classroom as an active learning strategy. And several faculty members would have us come in and do these large VR experiences. But the one that this talk really came from actually was from an introduction to African American history course. And it's a rather large course, around 75 to 100 students. And the faculty member would have us come in every semester to take the students to the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana. And you just see all of a sudden the students start making connections really quickly with things they were reading, with ideas that they'd heard, and really being able to visualize and see them. And the VR experience takes about 10 minutes. But the discussion afterwards, I think, is one of the most important pieces, right? The reflection component. And it always would lead to kind of a rapid fire of discussion, right? You can't reach every student. You're trying to reach them as quickly as you can in the order they raise their hands. But with 75 to 100 students, that can be really hard. But one particular course, a student, her question really centered around this idea of, why is it that we are so willing to mourn the death of people in tragedies? And an example she gave was September 11th, but we're not willing to really discuss the hurt and mourn that slavery caused. And it was a really well-articulated question, much better than I just stated it there. And it was one that really kind of triggered a lot of thinking in the classroom. But the student who went after her started her statement with saying, "You're coming in hot on me right now." And what she went on to say is, you're making me rethink everything, rethink all of the ways I look at this information, all of the ways I look at what we're talking about in this course, who I am, my positionality. And so that's where this talk came from, right? And because my hope is that with active learning, we have the opportunity to go deeper in the learning with our students. We have the opportunity to spark deep conversations, difficult conversations, things that take us to some very challenging places that are so necessary for where we are. And so I hope that today we can all come in hot together, because these conversations can no longer wait. The conversations around equity, in the words of Dr. King, we can no longer wait. So just to get us started on active learning, I know I'm talking to an academy of folks who are the active learning faithful. So I'm not going to go into too many details about what we already know about why active learning is helpful, but I do want to talk about active learning specifically in the context of inclusive and equitable teaching. So there's lots of things that we know about active learning, and I have a list here on the screen, right? It closes our achievement gap, it helps us with application and creativity. But the two that I've underlined to me are central tenets for the inclusive conversation, right? And that is self-sense making and the construction of narratives. So it's really important that our students can see themselves in the learning process. That's what helps make the active active. And so really lately I've been drawn to the work of Jennifer Moon. And this work was really focused on where reflection and experiential learning kind of come together, and how reflection is an essential component of the learning process. And reflection often gets a bad rap, right? For our students, it's the kind of throwaway thing that we ask them to do. They don't really think about it as a learning process. I think some of us maybe even are guilty of that as well. But reflection is actually really central to learning. The ability to pull information inward, as I would tell my students, pull it in, see where it settles before it comes back out in a larger conversation. And so Jennifer Moon's work really goes through what that process of reflection looks like. And so she has 5 steps, and you can see them here. Noticing can happen consciously and unconsciously. And this is literally that basic space of something just happened. I noticed something happened, right? Making sense, this is where students start to understand a concept. So they're not expanding on it, they're not bringing in additional information, they're simply working to understand. So when I teach sports sociology, I need them to make sense of the sociological imagination, right? We're never going to get to the place of applying it if they can't make sense of what C. Wright Mills is asking us in our sociological questions. Making meaning, this moves the students from simply understanding a concept to understanding the concept within their context. So they're not bringing in additional information, pulling from prior knowledge in other courses, but they're taking what they just made sense of and now make a meaningful understanding of what it means to them. Working with meaning is where I think many of us start to get excited about teaching, because this is where the student starts to pull in their prior knowledge from other courses, their experiences, and they start to expand what that meaning means in terms of a much broader understanding of their wider learning. And then transformational learning, I think, is where the joy of teaching is for many of us, right? This is that moment that the light bulb goes off, the spark, right? It's when they start to pull together all of that prior knowledge, those experiences, this additional information, the thing that they've made sense and meaning of, and they now transform it into something new, right? It becomes transformed into a completely new concept. And this is the exciting pieces of teaching. What I like about this with Bloom's is I think this is where active learning wants to get us, right? It wants to move us from just noticing and get us kind of embarked on these last 4. But it also overlays really well with Bloom's taxonomy. So if you're looking at it from here, you can see that making sense and noticing really are in that memory and understanding phase, and then we move right up to creation. This also overlays even better with the revised Bloom's taxonomy out of Iowa State, which actually adds a knowledge dimension to the cognitive process. And so as we start to think about the type of knowledge that we're asking our students to navigate through, then we can also better understand the process. So for me, when I'm thinking about how do I engage my students around these conversations of active learning, I start here. How do I help my students, one, better understand reflection as an active part of the learning process, but then also how do I get them to start this journey of moving from just making sense to really moving to this transformative place. And so I want to pause right here for just a moment to see if there are any questions that I can answer. I have a couple of places throughout that I can do this in. Just checking with the moderators.
If you haven't had a chance to turn on your chat feature for the Zoom, please do so. We've got a couple people who have posted. We had someone who's thanked you for starting with land acknowledgement and mentioning that there is an app for the iPhone. It's called Native Land that is a convenient platform for most students as well to be shared. I don't think we have any other questions at this moment.
Okay, perfect. All right, so this leads me into kind of the next portion of these are kind of background information that I think you need up front. So I believe it's important for us to kind of draw some attention to what we know about student success as well, right? And so Vince Tinto, who is arguably one of the foremost authorities on student success and retention, and has been for the past 50 years, has really laid the groundwork for a lot of what we know about how students connect with learning and how they connect with our campuses. And so his work with Alexander Aston and George Koo are often kind of the forefront of the conversations we have around student success. He came up with a list of indicators that he then was able to verify that really are the starting places for how we know a student's going to be successful. And the number one indicator of student success is actually faculty to student contact. And this one I want to start with because it gets misconstrued several times. So faculty are often told things like this, and then they think it has to be these really deep mentoring relationships, or it's these more contact time that they have at the front of the classroom. And though both of those things are helpful, that's not really what this is getting at. What Tinto's work is telling us is actually all of those contact points, formal and informal, that you have as a faculty member with students shifts us closer to success. And this can come in from when you have them working in groups and you work your way around the room and you have small conversations. It comes in office hours, but it also comes in you just acknowledging a student as you walk across campus. And so it's really important to understand the role faculty play in these conversations around success. The second indicator of student success is peer-to-peer contact. And I think this one many of us know and assume, right? We know students rather learn from each other than from just about anywhere else. And so it's important to think those things through. But what does this have to do with these conversations around equity? It has to do a lot. Because when a hot moment happens in your classroom, so a moment when something is said or done that causes hurt or harm, and we choose not to acknowledge it or we let it go, the student who's been hurt and harmed will often foreclose on that faculty member in that moment. So anything you say after that is not reliable and is no longer held in any type of esteem. And so that forecloses those students right away to that number one indicator of success. The second thing that happens is that the student who's done that harm, if it's a student who's done it, is often kind of ostracized from the rest of the class, right? And so we've now also foreclosed on the second indicator of student success. And that student who's done the harm, whether it's intentional or unintentional, they also aren't learning about what that harm is and how not to repeat it. So it's really important that when things happen in our classroom, we're equipped with at least foundational skills to be able to say, something just happened. And I might not know how to deal with it right now, and I'm going to be honest and upfront about it, but I do want to acknowledge that I notice a shift in the room and that we need to talk about it, right? And as we get further in the presentation, I'll actually give you some techniques on how to do that. But it's really important that we have that understanding of understanding how essential that relationship between peers, as well as between the faculty and the student, are to students being successful in their learning. And so this is really at the heart of why we also need to know what framework we want to use when we're teaching around any topic, but particularly when we're talking about difficult topics like equity and inclusion. And so many of us start here in this place of academic detachment and analysis. This is where most of us have been trained, and it's where we're comfortable, and it's where our students are comfortable because it's where they've been for the past 13 years. And so academic detachment is that process of when we say, well, what do our readings tell us? What does the literature tell us? What are the experts telling us around this topic? And it's somewhat of a safer place to work. And it allows us to stay in a space of thought work, right? We're just going to think our way through what this problem is. The problem becomes that when we do this work around inclusive teaching and we want to talk about challenging topics, as we desperately need to do, you can't do that without thinking about heart work, right? Through thought work with heart work, we make change happen. So when we start into academic detachment, it makes sense. It's a comfortable place to start. But if we stay there, that might not be the best place. So there are two additional frameworks that I want to throw at you and that hopefully you'll find helpful. And so one of them is civic humanism and civic discourse. And this is often the next step, right? And this is a lot of Derek Bach's work. And it's where we start talking about we're global citizens in a society, right? We have a moral responsibility to have some of these discussions and to think about our work in them. The third one might be a little bit more familiar because it comes out of Paulo Freire's work, right? And it's a liberation process, a critical consciousness. And so one of my dear friends, who's also a great writing partner of mine, she always equates this to cars as a helpful analogy for this. And so she likes to start with the fact that we commute all the time. We might not be doing it quite as much right now because of the pandemic, but we drive a lot, right? And there's cars passing you all the time, and you might not really recognize the type or model. You just know you've passed a lot of cars. This changes if you start to go car shopping, right? So I drive a Fiat SUV, which is really a thing, so you can Google that. But I did my research, I studied the car, and decided this is the car for me. And then all of a sudden I went from no one else owns a Fiat, it's a weird car, no one else would have it, to, oh my goodness, everyone in the world now owns a Fiat, right? I see them everywhere. I see my particular Fiat everywhere. I now know things about the makes and years and models of a Fiat, things that I didn't even want to know. And so this is what critical consciousness really is, right? It's this idea that I now see something and I can't unsee it. So if you think about something such as systemic racism, it surrounds us. We live in it. We engage with it every day, but we might not be conscious of it. But the minute we study it and unpack it and we see it, you can't unsee it. It's ever present. And that's where liberation really gets us at. And so it's really important as you go through your teaching that you know which of these frameworks you want to work in. And you can work in all of them throughout a given course or semester. But you need to know in that moment of that activity or that process of learning, where it is that you want the students to land. Are we staying in a space of academic detachment, or am I really starting to now ready, because you've done that foundation, to move forward into the next phase? Now, this is all well and good, but we know students resist, right? Students do not like change, much like many of us, right? And so they'll ask several reasons about why they don't want to do this. And you've got to think about from their perspective that for over a decade, they've been learning that education is a depositing system, right? We dump information in, the best teachers can help them take information and make it knowledge. But the reality is that a foundational understanding of learning for them is about, you deposit the information, tell me what I'm going to need for the test, I'll deposit it back out, almost like a bank, right? And so active learning, and in particular, inclusive active learning, it kind of forces students to do work. They haven't had to do the actual work of learning up to this point. And so they're going to resist. As a kinesiologist, I like to give my students this example, so bear with me. I try to remind them that we have to get intellectually sweaty if we're going to get good at anything. So I always ask them to think about the first time they ever lifted weights. Now, I'm a skateboarder and BMX, like that was my introduction to sport, so I did not lift weights. My response often to weight training courses is, that looks heavy. You should go for your personal best, which is not the right thing to tell anyone. But I asked them about, what's the first time you ever lifted weights? Did you start going in there saying, load me up, put 300 pounds on, I'm ready to do it? And they're like, no, you start with the bar. The bar is like 40 pounds. You got to start there. And then you start adding weight from that. And right, that's what learning looks like. And our students haven't necessarily been engaged in learning in that way. So they're going to resist. And it's important that you spend some time with them up front to talk about some very different ideas about why we're going to learn the way we're going to learn. they're afraid they're going to get information wrong. They're afraid that they're going to get out into the world and not really know how to do something that they think we're preparing them to know how to do. And so they're flying with almost like a safety harness, right? They're on the trapeze, but they're anchored to something. And what we're trying to ask them to do is, no, I want you to try this, but without the harness, but only with a safety net. And so our job is to help them think about how exhilarating learning can be when we're not tethered to an anchor. And so I always try to do this in small steps with my students. And this is extremely helpful for our students who are traditionally from marginalized identities, right? Because they in particular have a lot of survival brain type work that they're having to do to navigate in that space. So the easier I make it for them to understand and trust that we are building a foundation, a scaffolding of practice before we get to these larger pieces, the less they'll be resistant to this work. Now, I do want to say this is a caveat. This is Laura Pipe's philosophy on homework. I will also share with you what I'm finding in my own work is that it's also an Indigenous perspective on homework. Homework is meant to be practice. And if it's meant to be practice, then we're asking them to practice ideas and concepts. And in practice, you can get things wrong. Practice is about making the errors, making the mistakes, so that when you get to the performance, you get to the game, you can be more consistent, right? And so this idea that we grade practice for correction can be really challenging. And I know that's not true of every discipline. There's some disciplines where no, you do have to grade homework in that way. But this idea of helping our students see homework as practice means that we have to think about then how we grade practice. For me, it's grading homework for completion. Did you give it a try? Great, then you get the full points, but you're gonna get a lot of feedback as well, right? So you're getting the formative pieces that this tool should be. So it's important to think about those things. The other piece of this with resistance that I want to bring up is actually coming from some work that I've recently fallen in love with, and it's Maria Battiste's work. She's an Indigenous scholar out of British Columbia, and she brings us to the idea of what learning can be about, right? She talks about the learning spirit. And so for some Indigenous cultures, the learning spirit is endowed to us at birth by the Creator, and it directs us forward in our desire to learn. It creates this thirst, right? And that might not resonate with you. But I think we can all kind of come together around this idea about curiosity as a driving force for learning. And at some point, we taught kids that curiosity was not what learning looked like. And so what I'm talking about here when I talk about active learning is really at its root a process of igniting that curiosity, of igniting this learning spirit. And so this leads me to some more recent work that I and a colleague have been working on. And then bear with me because I wasn't originally planning on putting this in this talk. So I'm hoping I can do this in a concise way. But Jules thought it would be useful, so I'm bringing it in. And so we've been working on this project around what we call TALS, toward a liberated learning spirit. And it's a model for developing critical consciousness. And we've been testing it in several courses and finding that it is indeed resonating with students in the learning process. But this framework takes into account kind of traditional best practices in equity and social justice and pulls it together with the work of Dr. Martin Luther King and his 6 steps for nonviolent direct action and social change, as well as some Indigenous pedagogy practices. And so it is heavily focused on active, experiential, and applied learning. And so what it does is it actually starts, I'm going to pull up hopefully my annotation piece here. It starts over here in this area. It's not letting me draw a circle, but over here in this area of tender resistance, it moves through academic detachment. So tender resistance is the work of Michelle Tanaka. And many of us have done this work, but we just didn't have a term for it. But tender resistance is the act of giving students both the reality and the hope. And so one of my colleagues who works with pre-service teachers always talks about they can send their students out with all of the hope and promise of what education is, but when they get into the school system, they're immediately going to be crushed by a wave of reality of what the system itself is. Or they can focus heavily on the reality of what the system is and have no hope. And then when they send their students out, nobody's going to want to teach. Right? And so you have to do a blend of both, right? You have to help our students understand the potential, but also the reality of the spaces we live in. And academic detachment is the safest place to sometimes start with that work, right? It's a safe foundation. But when we don't want to stay there and we want to help our students move forward, we want our students to start to think about all of the things they bring with them, all of the knowledge, all of the experiences, right? Getting to that meaning-making space. And the best way to do that is helping them share their own narratives, share their own experiences, share the things that they know with each other. And that only happens when we create what Tanaka also calls a safe enough space. And we'll talk a little later on how to do that, but that's things like community agreements, classroom norms, role playing and practicing discussions, right? And it's helping students begin to see that they themselves can be authors of knowledge as well. At each stage of this, it comes back to a reflection or pulling things into the core. And so you'll see academic attachment goes into reflection, and then reflection comes back out into the space of unlearning. Unlearning is a necessary product of kind of where we're at. Let me see, should be the next. Oh, I gotta get out of annotate, sorry. Okay, it's further along. So unlearning is a necessary product of where we're at because learning is internalized and learning is also colonized. And so we have to help our students unlearn some of that behavior that led to that resistance. And experiential learning is an amazing space for this to happen. We use the example of the self-purification that Dr. King talked about a lot in his work. In particular, Dr. King, before they would go into a larger protest, would have the protesters actually role play a lot of the backlash they would feel, the harm that they would undergo, so that they could then respond in the moment, not in a surprise and in an emotional state, but actually respond in a very nonviolent way. But they had to practice it. And this is true of difficult conversations and difficult dialogues, right? We have to give our students the tools to prepare them to have some of these conversations so that when things happen in the classroom, they're not immediately triggered and surprised. They're actually able to process through some of what was said, and we're able to keep the learning process going. The unlearning then leads into application. And this comes from Dr. King's work with the direct action, and it also comes from Moon's work with meaning making and working with meaning. And application is now, I've done the practice, I've done this work, now let's put it into play. I've done the practice on how to have difficult dialogues and discourse, now let's actually have difficult dialogues and discourse. Or in my own discipline, when I teach my sports sociology courses, I actually have my students spend all semester practicing how do I identify what a social issue is in a community, and how do I think about physical activity and recreation as an intervention to help shift the community to a more healthy position. And so their actual application project becomes a recreation proposal that they have to write for their community to address a social issue in their hometown. And so it starts that process of them actually applying these. Then that leads to liberation, to that space of critical consciousness. I've now seen it, I can't unsee it. And then they start the circle all over again, because you start that process with almost fresh eyes. So you can reread the same literature again and see things completely differently because now you've seen other things. The nice thing for us in this circle, and what we're finding when we use it in courses and course development, is that I'm not doing the whole entire circle in one course, right? I'm starting at different places based off from where my students are in the process. And I'm going as far as the course and the students are able to go, and building. I'm building my way through this. And so it's a helpful model for us in the work that we're doing with students. I can also say I've seen a shift in the courses where I teach this in, where the students take a much larger ownership for the learning process. And so one example came very early on in spring of last year. I was out sick and I had sent all the students an email saying we weren't going to have class, and they met without me. That doesn't happen in a normal course. But they said, you gave us an assignment to do, and we were all kind of in the area. So we just decided we were going to have class and do the assignment together. It's this building, particularly that happens in this area of embracing narratives and that relationship building with unlearning, that allows things like that to happen. So now I'm ready for my next slide. The other piece of that unlearning that becomes essential is actually addressing the power over or white supremacy culture that we perpetuate in education. And so here's a list that Tema Okun came up with, and she's actually out of Durham, so she is local, which is great. But this is a list of where white supremacy and power over culture show up in our society. And every time I look at this list, I'm struck at how much of this we reproduce in our classrooms, because it's something that we've been told is the answer, right? We've been told this is the right way to learn. And so part of the unlearning process for our students, as well as for ourselves, is to challenge these. I think particularly this idea of a belief in objectivity and this belief in a right to comfort are extremely present in my own discipline, and they can be really challenging for students to wrestle with. And so it's an important thing for us to think about as we move through. And you're probably thinking, great, but how do I do that? And so for me, it's been the work of Terry Yoso. Terry Yoso developed a cultural wealth model back in 2016. She interviewed quite a few students who are Latina, Latino, and Latinx, and talked to them about what their classroom experience was like and what they were bringing to the classroom, and that what wasn't being acknowledged. And what she really came back with is there is a lot of knowledge and wealth left on the table that we don't count. And so as we start to develop assignments and projects and programs, really thinking about what counts as learning, what counts as prior knowledge, and what counts as part of that process. And so the example she gives on linguistic communication is particularly how we don't value or prioritize a student's ability to code switch between languages and dialects, right? In many cases, we think we know we've got to teach them proper business English. That's part of our job and responsibility. And she challenges us to think about, why does it have to be a but or, and why can't it be a both and, right? And why can't we value and acknowledge the energy and effort it takes to code switch between multiple languages? This also leads into these other 5 areas. Resistance and navigational capital really are about how students navigate in systems, particularly systems that were not created for them to be successful. And the ability to do that takes a great deal of wealth. Familial and social capital, the ability to use networks, the ability to use peers in that learning process, and how they're enriching that process often gets overlooked. And then aspirational capital. This is one that we overlook a lot. And I think of often about an example that we get about first-year students, where we talk about first-year students don't know much about college, when in reality, they may have been talking about going to college every night at the dinner table. So the aspirational piece is essential as well. So as we come back to this model, I wanted to start with another quote from Maria Battiste about unlearning. And as I said before, we have to understand that learning is an internalized process. We're told how it's best for us to learn. And learning is also a colonized process. And this one, I think, has been probably one of the most challenging ones to wrestle with as an educator. So if you're familiar at all with the colonial matrix of power, which is some of Walter Magnolo's work, he's out of Duke. The colonial matrix of power is actually, several people did this research where they looked at how colonizers colonize and how that process has happened throughout time. And what they came down to is essentially a four-legged stool that props up the process of colonization. And it actually props up patriarchy and racism, which perpetuates colonization. And of those four legs, one of the first legs is actually knowledge and subjectivity. So this process of teaching individuals that there is singular or specified ways of developing and understanding what knowledge is and ways of knowing, or as Magnolo calls it, buying into the European house of knowledge, and that is progress and that other ways of knowing are not, is one of the first pieces that colonizers go through. That leads to how we develop relationships with authority. That goes into how we value labor, particularly how we create a hierarchy in labor. And then it also goes into how we view gender and sexuality and gender roles. And so that props up the system. And so what that unlearning is so essential to us starting to realize and acknowledge that maybe the systems we're buying into as the privileged spaces of knowledge are indeed spaces that are meant to constrain or to remove certain ways of knowing, to dominate and oppress, right? And so this is an important concept to have as well. And one way to do that, and that I do this with my own students, because I work in kinesiology with a lot of students who are heavy in STEM, is to use the ladder of inference. And this ladder makes me laugh every time, because it is very much a scientific method approach to how we do and think and create feelings and culture. The two gentlemen who created this actually created it as a way to win at business meetings. And so it's been very fascinating to watch it be really pulled into the diversity community and it to become kind of a cornerstone of the work on how we look at equity. But it takes us from an action and works us back down to how we got to that place. And it always boils down to, we've had a set of data that we've looked at and we've made selections, right? We've made selections on what those observations were going to be and how we were going to process that information. And that leads into kind of, how we make assumptions, how we make conclusions that then become beliefs and that lead to then actions. This is also helpful when you're addressing a hot moment with students, because you're able to then work backwards, right? Something's happened in our classroom. Let's talk about how we got to this space. And it is very helpful, I found, with STEM majors, because it makes sense. It's a funneling effect. So I do want to pause here just for a moment to take questions, because I know I've thrown a lot of content at you.
So as we wait for people to write in their comments in the chat box, I wanted to read a couple of comments that have already come up as you were talking, Dr. Pipe. So Bobby Hobgood writes, and this was when you were discussing your strategies about homework. He writes, right on, Laura, I teach world language, and we always tell students they must take risks and make mistakes in order to develop fluency. So then why do we penalize them on homework assignments if we at the same time are telling them that they should do so? The hypocrisy of it all needs to be carefully considered if we truly believe in homework as practice towards success. When you were talking about code switching, Enoch Park gives the example of the acceptance of academic acceptance of Black English vernacular in writing and presentations. And then just now when you're discussing some of the colonial power dynamics as they seep into education, Olga Padilla-Falto writes, also when teaching heritage learners of a second language, for example, Spanish, and not acknowledging their language as a valid academic language. So lots of really good comments and examples of what we've been discussing.
And the one on language, to me, is always one that has hit in a lot of ways. And I think it's because I work with particularly a lot of international students in kinesiology and in sports studies. And I always am floored with how quickly colleagues are willing to say, oh, I hate grading their papers. I hate reading them because they're so hard to understand. And I keep being so floored by saying, you realize like they're doing this thought process in 2 languages and you can only do 1, right? And that we don't acknowledge the wealth of that. So for me, I think the language piece is just it's a simple example, but it's true that we do it with lots of things, right? We are quick to say to our students, but you're not doing it the way we were taught. So clearly you're not learning.
We also have a question and comment from Fred Baker, who writes, given that education predominantly operates in systems and structures, which are ultimately necessary on some level in order to manage the flow of people and resources, track progress, predict and anticipate results, provide consistency, etc., what are the main challenges for encouraging critical and humanist approaches that function within the constraints of these systems, necessary or otherwise?
So there's a lot. There's a lot of social challenges that come out of it, right? And so we see it from our students in particular, where they're very confused why in this course, I'm asking them to think in this way at this level, and my colleagues are not, right? And I think all of us, particularly in active learning, when you get your teaching evaluations, my favorite one is always I had to teach myself, right? That they really struggle with that. And when you're getting into the civic humanism and the liberation piece, that becomes even more prevalent, particularly for students who are not open to or ready for that conversation. My other favorite thing on almost every single one of my teaching evaluations is she likes to answer questions with questions. Like, welcome to academia. That's how we roll. We love questions, right? And then as far as the systems pieces go, for the structure and system we live in, there's a number of challenges, which is why it's important that we have these conversations so that we can change those systems, right? And change some of those structures that prevent us from understanding what's going on. There's tons and tons of work out there right now on grading, right? Not only how do we grade for equity, but how do we go through a course without giving any grades, right? How do we embrace learning fully without that process? And I think that's a challenge that each discipline has to focus on their own, right? And so being in kinesiology, which is a very odd field if you don't know much about kinesiology, we're a young discipline, and we're still trying to figure out who we are when we grow up. But we range the arts and sciences, right? So we have all of these sub-disciplines within, and I'm a socio-historical kinesiologist, right? So I align closer with sociology, history, cultural studies than some of my colleagues and peers in physiology. And so we have to have that debate on what are the structures needed in a physiology course to really be able to let our students graduate and say they're going on to medical school for sports medicine, where yes, I want you to know certain things and be able to tell them to me in just a making sense fashion as much as the making meaning with. Versus all on the other side, what are the challenges of, no, I really need my students to be able to think about these questions in a sociological way, right? I need them to have a sociological imagination. And so those challenges are very specific to your discipline, and they're conversations that I encourage folks to go back and have. There was a great article that came out in the Chronicle that I put a copy in the folder that Jules will share with you, about how we interrogate our disciplines. And interrogating your discipline around these ideas of colonizing practices is so important right now that we're doing that and having those conversations.
I have a really quick kind of practical question for you. So I'm teaching a course that's designed for first-year students coming right out of high school, and we've been reading some Freire and some bell hooks on liberation pedagogy, and they've really enjoyed this kind of peek behind the curtain about why I structure my class in a certain way to facilitate those kind of pedagogical goals. Do you show your students the diagrams that you're sharing with us to kind of explain why you're teaching the way that you do?
Yes, well, and some of it's because I work in a teaching and learning center, but I encourage all of my faculty to be that transparent. Students really do want to know why we do what we do. And that hit me several years ago when I was teaching a large, like 100-person course. And you can't see it here, obviously, because I'm sitting, but I wander the classroom. right? It's how I do it. It's called proximity. It's important. It's a great skill to have. And I had a student say to me when we did our mid-semester evaluation of the course, she said, I get here early to sit on the front row for a reason, and you moving around is not okay. And I realized, oh my gosh, I need to explain to her why I'm doing this, right? And since then, I now explain everything that I do. So my students do see this. The colonial matrix of power, I added it to my undergraduate course for the history of sport, which was taught specifically to first-year students. We look at Native and Indigenous sport in particular. And so I added the colonial matrix of power the very second day of class, and my students talked about it the entire time. It resonated when, and several of the students that were in there are Indigenous students who then later on this past September did a presentation for our faculty on Indigenous pedagogy locally. And they brought up the colonial matrix of power. That is where they started. Then they followed up with, let's talk about power over in white supremacy culture. And we're talking about 18, 19-year-old students kind of fresh out of high school. So it does resonate with them when we show them transparently why we're making the decisions we make.
I wanted to read quickly, Fred Baker followed up with a couple of comments. So wrote, much of what you're discussing is intimately integrated in open education, democratic approaches, et cetera, but don't often fit well with these other more traditional structures. But then also writes, thank you. This also resonates with a lot of work being done by Jesse Stommel and others and the Hybrid Pedagogy Journal. These conversations are important. Kiran Budrani writes, how would you suggest that instructors, quote, put into practice, such as maybe create a plan or course blueprint that infuses the active learning ideas you have shared regarding the humanist, social, and cultural features of the learning process?
So Karen, that is one of the hardest pieces because, so I'm gonna peek behind the curtain here for Laura Pipe too. If you've ever done strengths and strengths finder, it's a process out of Gallup where you kind of rate 34 strengths of things that you tend to gravitate towards naturally. I bring it up because my natural inclination is not discipline and focus. That's actually number 33 and number 34 on my list. I also have ADHD, so discipline and focus are not my jam. When I'm doing this work, I have to get very disciplined and focused, right? So for me, it's doing an alignment chart for every course I do. And in an alignment chart, I take my learning outcome, I take then how I'm gonna assess it, and then I take how I'm gonna get my learning activity, and then what are all the readings, what are the lectures, when that needs to happen in the semester. It gets very detailed very quickly, which is a lot of exhausting work for somebody who does not like focus or discipline. But what that does is it allows me to map out my course so I know where I'm scaffolding. And what I found particularly with TALS, so that same course, that native course that I taught in the spring, which is the course that they all showed up to when I was sick, which was fascinating to have that happen. I found that you bounce around between all of those. And some of it, you've also got to be really flexible. Where are the students willing to go? And I need to be prepared to go there too, right? So one course I came in and I was so prepared to talk about Bright Path, which is Jim Thorpe. His real name is Bright Path. And I get so excited to talk about that because I just find him fascinating and he's overlooked and the students have no idea who he is because apparently I'm old. And I was so excited to talk about it. But the other reading from that week was about powwows and how powwows are constructed. And the students said, I'm glad you want to talk about Bright Path and I appreciate this, but can we save it till next week? Because I really want to not only discuss powwows, but I want to actually, one of them was like, let me talk to you about the history of each of these dances and the stories they tell, right? You've got to be flexible to let the students really navigate, right? And that was a moment of really critical consciousness for all of us, right? We all of a sudden in that moment were able to truly understand what is the value of a powwow and where did that history come from and where do each of these dances hit and how difficult it is for someone to make decisions around what dance they're going to learn and specialize in because they're very spiritual pieces, right? So it's one of those processes that is very fluid for me, but it starts with a very structured plan that I can then be flexible and deviate from.
Well, I don't think we have any other questions in the chat box for right now, so we'll keep going, I suppose. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so we have, I think, about 30 minutes. So I'm going to try to get through the rest of this because it's a lot, but this gets into some of the strategies. But you'll have a copy of this PowerPoint, and my PowerPoints typically have a lot of information that I don't directly talk about, but they're there as background information. So how do we do all of this? And so here's some strategies for inclusive teaching. And these strategies and activities, you'll notice, align really heavily with some of the things we know about active learning, right? And so these ideas about what is active listening and how we engage in those pieces. How do we bring out things like personal points of view? How do we bring in examples? How do we have our students begin to engage with that? And then this one here in the middle that goes kind of between teaching strategies and teaching activities, which is attending to intent versus impact. And I have an activity a little bit later that we'll talk about that you can use in a class to talk about specifically intent versus impact. So how do you build this, right? So you've heard me talk about building the trust and having these conversations, and it really is about building a structure in your course. And for me, it starts with a very strong foundation, and that foundation only happens if we're able to create a space of inclusiveness where we're willing to be somewhat vulnerable with each other. I hope you noticed in the TALS model, we use the term safe enough space, not safe space. And that is because a classroom is not a safe space. And it's not a safe space for a lot of reasons, but the term safe space really is meant for places of healing, right? It's meant for places like therapy and healing circles and spaces where we're able to address trauma. And that's not a classroom, right? And unless you're in counseling, that's really not what the classroom is. And so establishing what it is that you need to establish for a safe enough space for this work to happen is important. And for me, it's through this conversation around community agreements and ground rules. And in a moment, I'll show you how we do that, and then also how you do that online. The other piece is also then helping students develop a positive attitude about what learning looks like. Many of them have had experiences that really do shape what they think not only a learner looks like, but what is the positive outcome of learning. And so that can be done through learning contracts, experiential activities, the practice piece, right? That allows them to build some of that confidence. And then we also want to enhance the meaning. So as you noticed with Moon's work, we're moving from not just understanding and making sense, but the making meaning and working with meaning, right? The minute we get to making meaning and working with meaning, students start to see themselves. And so back up to Tinto's work about what we know about student success, the third indicator of student success is actually a process of developing an identity with the institution and with yourself as a scholar. And so that one also gets misinterpreted a lot of times with fun co-curricular activities and extracurricular activities like midnight breakfast and sporting events. And that's not what that meant. What Tinto actually meant in that work was the minute students are able to see themselves as scholars and authors of knowledge, they immediately become more successful because they see themselves as part of the process of learning. They're not just the receivers of learning. And that can be done through projects and simulations and case studies, places again for them to practice. And then the fourth piece is this engendering competence, right? And so helping them be able to actually see, wait, I've built this, right? I've built this learning. It wasn't given to me. It wasn't handed to me. I literally did this process of learning. And that is through a lot of different ways. For me, it's through final projects that get them into direct action. So that example that I gave about the recreation problem that I have my students work on, at the end of my course, I have had a number of students actually go back to their hometowns and meet with their city councils and present to them, here's a social issue around health that I'm seeing, right? And oftentimes it's around how city parks are not equitable, they're not well built in ways that are equally accessible to everyone in the community. And they give solutions, they bring solutions, and several of them are actually working on projects now around those things. I have a student actually from Charlotte who is working with his father's company to look at some of the food desert situations in areas of Charlotte based off from that final project, right? And that came out of this process of having them see the learning they did, the work they did in that process. So how do you develop these community agreements, right? And there's lots of different ways to do this with our students, these ground rules. When I teach a large course of 100, I don't do it the same way that I do it in a smaller course of 20, right? But I start with the same question every time. And it's a great question. It comes out of the work of Claude Steele. And it's, what are the guidelines we can agree on now in order to create a learning environment in which we can ask each other anything? And this is really important because what I find with students, particularly when I let them shape them, is they start to all of a sudden have really real conversations about being afraid of saying things that they think are messing up, being afraid of taking missteps, really concerned about then how do we recover from that? How do we hold each other accountable for things that we say that hurt, right? And the students are coming up with that process, and they come up with some really great rules. One course, I actually had my students come up with and have the conversation with me that I now present to many of my faculty members, where they said, in this class, we're not responsible for histories, but we are responsible for today and tomorrow. So you will not be held accountable for all the things that you feel guilty because people in your past had power and privilege and they didn't wield it in correct ways that shared that power and privilege. But you are responsible for what you do from this moment forward, from the moment you see it. And that's really powerful to have students get to that place on the second day of class, right? They're having these conversations very early. And so we develop these ground rules together. When I have a large course, I might come in with a few things and then we work on defining it. So, you know, one of the things on here is reframing non-specific language. So a great example is students will always throw out first thing, well, we're going to respect each other. That's not specific, right? So we need to talk about what are the actions that shape respect. How do we know we're respecting each other? So when I'm in a large course, I might have respect, active listening, and then we spend time defining what that looks like for us as a class. Versus when I have just about 20, 25 to 40 students, I might let them come there on their own. Again, it's important to note we're not creating a safe space. We're creating active spaces. We're creating safe enough spaces. So you've got to define that for the students. Hold on a second, my dog's barking. All the joys of working from home. Additionally, you really do need to solicit the students' input. You need to solicit the student input on this, because if they can't buy into the actions, if they can't see them and can't understand why they're doing these things, they're not going to enact them throughout the course. So it's really important that you have some way that students can buy in and provide feedback on it, whether it be creating these guidelines together completely or creating them in part. And then you also have to develop ways that we're going to share with each other when something's not happening the way it should, right? So is it us saying, I would like to remind everyone of the ground rules we agreed on? Is it somebody saying, ouch, that hurt, and then let's talk about it? One faculty member I talked to, they used the terms ouch and sorry, right? So let's talk about the ouch that just happened, and then let's talk about like the sorry that this person has now about being aware. So you've got to think about what that looks like for each course. One class I had, I will tell you, I had students come up with that they were going to yell banana every time, and that got out of control. So you have to really know where you're going. So how is this different when you move online? You have to also think about how you define respect in an online environment. And you also have to consider the unique situations that our students face in online. So Things like the dog, I wouldn't see that in a classroom, but I am going to see it here, right, in these spaces. How do I handle that? If I'm in a space that's unsafe, how do I handle having some of these difficult dialogues where I might want to talk about things that I have not discussed with other people that I live with, right? How are we going to handle that conversation? Cameras on and cameras off. How do I handle the situation of where I live and the people I live with? And you also have to be able to address how you want to handle recording of a situation, right? So particularly if we're having difficult dialogues, I like to tell students we're not taking screenshots, right? We're not taking screenshots of anyone in it. We're not taking screenshots of the chat. We're not taking video of this conversation, and that we're agreeing to that as a group. And so there is an example that I gave you in the folder that I want to kind of pull up real quickly of how we've done this online. And this was actually done for our Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Institute with faculty. And so we had a conversation around inclusive discussions and what they look like, and how we handle them, right? And what we're going to agree on. And this in particular was an asynchronous process that people were completing over the course of a semester. So we went ahead and created these ground rules for them. And then at the end gave them ways to add to them. But even something simple as discussion boards, we might talk about some things that are very difficult, specifically here when I talk about trauma and how trauma is present and it's not going to be fully addressed, right? And I know there's something I need to post and I want to post, but I can't be the one to post it, right? I don't want to be the one to have to talk about it, but it needs to be said. Giving them a space where they can email you as the instructor and you post it anonymously, right? It gives students more control of what that space looks like. And so just thinking through, now that I'm online, what are the situations that my students are having to handle and deal with that would not happen in a face-to-face setting, right? What are the things they automatically have to disclose because of where and who they are? So that brings me to another very important conversation that we have to have about how we handle these conversations and difficult topics. And it starts with intent, right? Like I said before about planning the framework you want to use, you've got to frame and plan what type of conversation you want to have in your class. And this is the one thing that my faculty come back and tell me after our Equity Institute has been the most important thing they've ever learned from me, which is kind of heartbreaking, but also helpful at the same time, is that the difference between debate, discussion, and dialogue, and that you have to be really clear with your students which of those you want them to participate in. Debates are important and they have a place, but you can't be having a dialogue and a debate breakout and you not know it, right? And so being very intentional on what it is that you want the students to do in that space and be very clear with them. We are going to have a discussion, right? Or we're going to have a structured debate. And so the example I always give when I teach my sports sociology class and the conversations of mascots come up, I cannot see both sides of the conversations on mascots, right? I know the violence and hurt that mascots have caused, making people caricatures, and I can't have my students have a dialogue about that because I can't, right? And so I set up a structured debate, right, where I have them debating possibly on sides that are opposite from what they believe, but we are able to get all of the issues out on the table in a way that's structured that we can then maybe have a discussion and dialogue later. But I know I can't be the one to trigger that conversation because it will not be a dialogue or discussion for me. And then when you move this online, these things still happen, right? And I still want to be able to use the discussion board and spaces to be able to have some of those same conversations. And so here's the things I've learned about how to move that online. Reflection is essential. So before you have a discussion board of any kind, have the students do a singular reflection assignment before that, right, on the same topic. They gather their thoughts, they go through that process, they test it, they have a better idea of what they're then going to post in the discussion board. It also prevents students from doing all of those things like trying to hear what other people are saying before they respond, right? Because it's 2 assignments. Make sure you have guidelines. There's tons of work out there on netiquette. The example I gave you is another one, right? You have to be very clear about what's acceptable behavior in an online discussion. And you have to be very clear with them about what responses you want them to have with other students. So just saying, respond to this question and then post your thoughts on 2 additional people's post doesn't really force them to do any thinking. But be very clear, right? I want you to think about the following thing as you read other people's posts. When you comment, talk about X, right? What are your philosophies on this, right? So when it comes to mascots, what is the potential harm that you see in mascots and using caricatures of people as mascots, right? You've got to be very specific. That's true of all discussion boards, not just in online courses. The other one that we've started to do now is actually use wikis more regularly in Canvas. And you can do this in Canvas fairly easily. And it's just simply creating a Canvas page. And then at the bottom, there's a space that actually you can say who can edit that page. And if you open it up to everyone in the class, it magically becomes a wiki, like Wikipedia, which resonates really well with students. But particularly around this work around equity, the thing that I think is the most challenging is the language. It's a steep learning curve, and the language is ever changing. And so even just having those of us in faculty try to have these conversations around language can be really challenging and very difficult, and actually can turn people off immediately from wanting to have these conversations. Now imagine you're a student, right? You're juggling a lot of things, and there's all this language that you might not be aware of that is foundational to this conversation. And many of these things have varying definitions. They're situational, right? Or they're contextualized in the culture and community that they exist. And so we started using a wiki to do that, where we started to ask, particularly faculty, but I've done it now with students too, to make a list. And I might give them a list, right? I might put in there ableism, Black Lives Matter, gender and sexuality, right? I might put up several things, power over culture, and then ask them to write in their kind of their own words. And then we start to have our own list of definitions that we can all work from, which is incredibly helpful. This too, much like everything, you got to have ground rules, right? So don't delete other people's work. We need to make this from a learning perspective. It is a process, it's practice, right? And how we engage in that. And it's worked really well. The students are much better at it than the faculty. And I think it's because as faculty, we're trained to, as one of my faculty members likes to tell me, I've got my red pen ready, right? We're trained to pull out the red pen and make things better, versus students are much more willing to say, that's a really interesting definition. I didn't think of it that way. How about this way? But it does start some of that dialogue and discussion in very kind of safe, organic ways. So I want to pause here a moment to see if there are any additional questions.
So this is Monica Sahani. I'm reading out a comment by Bobby Hopgood. The comment relates to clarity. It says, clarity, the overused structure of, quote, replied to 2 classmates, quote, end quote, with no guidance results in ritualistic compliance with answers that don't truly probe student thinking. It is clear you get what you ask for.
Yes, very much so, right? They do that. I agree. I understand. Oh, that's new, right? You need, if you're going to use discussion boards, you need to be intentional and thoughtful. All right, so I'm going to keep us going just because we only have about 10 minutes and the big stuff's here, or like I like to say, the headliner. Intention versus impact is an important conversation you should have with your students before you get to these difficult conversations. And so here's an example of how I do this in the classroom. And I do this very early on. And we have a conversation around what is intent and how does that show up in impact. And so I always say to them, let's say something's been said and it didn't land very well, it hurt. Is your first thought, dude, that person's a jerk? Or is your first thought, I wonder why they said that? And if your first thought is, I wonder why they said that, you are going to be in a group called intent. If your first thought is, what a jerk, you're going to be in impact, right? And I set them in two groups. I tell them this is a forced choice exercise. You can't be in the middle. And then I say, okay, I'm going to show you a statement. And if you are in my intent group, I want you to think about all the potential negative impacts of that statement. If you are in my impact group, I want you to think of all the possible intent that that person had. And then I show them this statement. And I picked this statement for one reason. It's going to come up and it takes it off the table, right? Because if I do this early on and I'm the one that's bringing it up, I don't have to necessarily rebuild trust because somebody has now said it and broken that trust. And I can get this out in the conversation early. And immediately you start to see the people who sided with intent, of course, are now all of a sudden going, oh, this can be really hurtful. And the people who are siding in impact are like, oh, that they might be just wanting to say something like, my entire family is racist and I don't want you to think I'm racist, right? And so they start to see very clearly that you can't separate intent and impact, right? They go together. And that's important that they have that understanding before we go into any difficult conversations so that that becomes their thinking. So you think about that process of self-purification that happens in unlearning. This is part of that, right? So you're not surprised. You're able to really think about, here are all the sides of why this might happen, and let's talk about it. And that also is a great space for the ladder of inference, right? This thing happened. Let's talk about how we got there. And so here is the quickest way to handle those hot moments if you feel like you're not necessarily equipped to do so. It's called the 4 C's. It comes from sustained dialogue and it works. And it deals with that intention versus impact. So something's been said. I don't see color. Ask for clarity. I hear you said this. Why do you think that? Where did that may possibly come from, right? If they're talking in big generalities, things that aren't talking in I statements or things they've observed, reshift them back to that. Where have you experienced these things? Where have they been, right? Where have you seen them, not where have you heard them, right? And so when a student says, well, I said it because my entire family is racist and I don't want you to think of me as racist, that's already an I statement. So then you can create space for others in the room to talk about what that impact has been. I'm seeing on folks' faces that just really made folks really uncomfortable, and they're not, I've seen a lot of feels. That's how I would say it. I'm seeing a lot of feels. Somebody want to share kind of what they're feeling, what they're thinking, what's going on? Because if you don't create that space, the students will, and it won't ever lead to a positive learning space, right? So creating that space allows for that dialogue to happen. And then you can change the counterpointing pieces, right? So you've had some students now share why saying I don't see color is problematic and why it's hurtful, right? Why it erases things that are very present and pretends like they're not there. How do we then talk about then the counter statement? So what does this mean now for as we move forward, right? Does this mean now we have a discussion about why color is present? Why these things are part of the learning process, why they're part of everyday systems, right? And so you really spend that credible piece of bringing, and sometimes it can be bringing in additional readings, right? This is also a space to say to students, you know, I might not be the best person to help us unpack it moving forward, but if you hang in with me, next class I'll have someone, or I'll send you some readings tonight that we can then discuss next time we meet, right? So, and it's okay in these spaces to admit that you don't know, that you just know something was wrong and you don't necessarily know the next steps, but you're going to get to the bottom of it. And for students, admitting that you don't necessarily know the right thing to do really humanizes you, and it really grows that learning environment, because you've built these ground rules, because you've built this trust relationship, and because you're dealing with some challenging topics. All right, so I think I made it with 7 minutes to spare, and I covered a lot.
There is one comment. This is once again Monica Sahani. There is one comment from Kelsey. She wants to thank you for differentiating between class sizes and, in particular, sharing what this might look like in large classes. She says her thank you again.
Yeah, it is very easy to do things when you have a small class, right? I mean, when you have a smaller class of 20, it is really easy to come up with the coolest things and somehow figure out how to grade them. The larger your class gets, the more challenging that becomes. And for me, I love teaching large classes. I do. That to me is the most fun. And I know I'm weird. But I feel like I can break them into smaller groups. I do a lot of team-based and collaborative learning, and I'm able to really build a community in a different way that to me is very much exciting. But you have to be intentional. It is different labor. And you have to be intentional on what that labor looks like.
Dr. Laura, I have a small question. When you say you do this with large classes, how large classes have you dealt with? Because I am one of those lucky ones who gets to teach classes close to 385 in one class.
So for me, the largest is about 120 to 150. So once you get to 200, 250, again, you're in a whole different bracket. And so in that group, I would approach it very similar to the example I gave you that I did with the asynchronous group, of giving them some things that are very clearly laid out, that these are the things we're going to agree on as a group. And that if there are additions or comments, that they can email you directly and then you can address them. One of the things that I didn't scroll in closely is at the bottom, there was a couple of clauses that I put in there. Like, one, you may email me this, and I can't promise that it'll get added, but I can promise it'll get addressed. And then I also added in there how I will respond if certain things or certain behaviors tend to start to happen, right? If harm is happening repeatedly, how I'm going to address it. And when you're in a class that large, it's really necessary to have some of those ground rules really laid out for them, and giving them that space to reflect on them.
From Beth Orton. Her comment is, I am wondering about ableism under debate on one of the previous slides.
Yeah, there's a handout that you'll get in the folder too from the University of Washington that breaks down those 4 categories even further and really goes into the ableism piece. But it really blends to this idea of debate is about a winner. There's a right and a wrong. There's an end outcome. And so it really does privilege this process of the fittest body wins. And so you have to be very intentional in how you structure debate for learning, unless you're teaching debate, right? I mean, that's different. But being very clear with them around what the outcome is going to be and who we as a community are going to be afterwards is important to counteract that natural tendency to debate to win.
I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat, but I think the floor is open. If anybody has questions, they can type in the chat. I'll be more than happy to coordinate those questions or comments. Okay, we got another one from Lenora Crabtree. Language used to identify groups, parenthesis, racial, socioeconomic, close parenthesis, is often problematic. I provide resources from APA to my students, but want to have the opportunity to be more engaged with this topic. The wiki looks like one possibility. Any other ideas?
Yes. So you'll notice that I use the term Latino, Latina, Latinx, and not just Latinx. And that actually came from our students. So we run a series of panels that we call Voices out of my office in conjunction with intercultural engagement. And so we invite students from different identity groups, and we specifically landed on identity because the intersectionalities come out very quickly for our faculty, and they see them in very real terms. So even though it looks like, well, we're only going to talk to Native and Indigenous students about Native and Indigenous problems, the reality is no, there's all these other identities within that. And it's a very controlled, protective setting. It's a very structured process where the faculty aren't allowed to ask questions to the student directly. They have to ask them to a moderator who can reframe them. Because we like to ask a lot of questions as faculty, but we don't necessarily always know the language to use. And then the students are able to really provide kind of critical feedback on all of these things. And language is particularly a challenging one because language and identities are complex and they are ever changing, right? We are always finding out new things to think about as we kind of develop categories and we try to figure out how we're going to identify things. And the question has come up multiple times now of what is their opinions on Latinx? And the students always come back saying it's very divisive because X in many of their communities, they associate with Mexico and not with gender. The language itself is very gendered and is a colonizing language. And one student said this last time that we had that panel, and I now use it and think about it often with lots of things. But he said, that's a very white academic solution to a very Latin problem, right? You're making decisions for us that are not okay. And I now think about that when I do lots of things, right? I'm like, am I making a white academic decision about a problem that's not my problem, right? And that's why those conversations with our students is so essential. So I have a couple of academic departments that are now working to set those up in their departments with their students specifically, so they can have some of those conversations. Things like talking circles where you have students kind of get in a circle and spend some time talking around some language. You can do it with slips of paper, you can throw out words. One of my colleagues uses a thing called a fishbowl, and there's actually an example of that in the handouts you're going to get. So you'll be able to see how to do that, where you have 3 or 4 people kind of in the center having a discussion around some of these topics while other people on the outside making observation. And then after they get to a certain point, the people on the outside are able to join in some of the conversation. So it's really opening the dialogue, right? I had one faculty member who tells me, I always use the term Black. I refuse to use the term African American because I grew up in the 70s and that was just what we do. And she said, how do you handle it? And I said, well, I talk to my students at the beginning of class and say, we're going to talk about a lot of topics, particularly around athletics. Here's the terms I typically use. What are our thoughts? And one of my students said, why are you not just using both? Why are you not saying Black African American or African American and Black? Right. And so giving your students power to help you navigate that is so essential.
Well, we are at time. I'm going to echo many of the sentiments that I'm seeing in the chat right now. We have many people thanking you for this presentation today, Laura. So the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, the Center for Teaching and Learning, the Active Learning Academy, thanks you so very much for giving this presentation. I'm going to stop the recording. I believe that Laura is willing to stay on a little bit longer. So if you want to hang around and talk a little bit more, we can do that. Thank you everyone for coming out today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.